We would like to tell something about micromagnetic tomography. So micromagnetic tomography is a new technique that was developed for paleomagnetism and rock magnetism, or actually is being developed right now. And of course, with every new method, there are some challenges and limitations, and we will discuss a bit about that later on. But first, what is it? So on the left is a figure of the Earth's magnetic field, and the field changes the direction and strength through time. So what that means is that the poles move places and sometimes even swap. So north becomes south and the other way around. And the strength varies quite a lot. And that is captured inside magnetic minerals. So I mainly look at igneous rocks. So if a volcano erupts and the lava cools down, then the iron-rich parts of the lava will capture the field that is present at that time. And this tells us a lot about what's going on the inside of the Earth. On the left, there are some samples from the Etna eruption in 2002. And typically, we measure these samples just the way they are. So we put them in a magnetometer and then determine the strength and direction of the magnetic field. And hopefully, for this one, we get declination, inclination, and a field strength that is actually known because it was measured at that time. But quite often, we don't get the right result. So even if we know what it should be, sometimes we don't. We cannot retrieve that from our samples. And that probably has to do with the bulk nature of this technique. So on the right side is a CT image of one of the samples, and the white dots indicate magnetite. So magnetite records the magnetic field. There are some larger ones, but there are thousands and thousands of very small ones on the micrometer scale. And well, we basically, if we have a look at the schematic here, the grains sometimes capture the magnetic field, right? So there are good recorders and there are bad recorders. And it has to do with a lot of things, for example, the shape of the magnetite, but also the size of the magnetite, or even mineralogy. So magnetite and hematite have different recording properties. And that means that we have some good recorders and bad recorders in our samples. And of course, if you combine these, then you will get a direction and a strength of the field that might not make sense, or you get very scattered data, and that's difficult to interpret. And micromagnetic tomography deals with it in a very different way. We make CT scans, so we have spatial and volumetric data on all the magnetic grains. And we do magnetic surface scans, which means that for every single grain, we know the magnetic moment. So in that way, if you combine that information, we can determine which grain contributes to the total magnetic moment of the rock. And hopefully we can discard the bad recorders and just have a look at the good ones and get some better information and more precise information than in bulk. So currently this is our workflow. We start with a piece of rock, we make a magnetic surface scan and we collect spatial data. We co-register these, so that means we just combine them, and that is a lot more difficult than it actually sounds. And we invert and we end up hopefully with a direction and strength of the magnetic field. Like I mentioned before, we do have some challenges in this method. And one of them is the resolution of the measurements. So in the graph, the dashed purple line indicates magnetization. And on the x-axis is the grain diameter of the magnetic recorders. And the red line indicates magnetic moment. So that's magnetization per volume. And the pink bar indicates the resolution which we can achieve right now with our micro CT. So that is The smallest grains are approximately 750 nanometers. But as can be seen in the graph, those are not the smallest grains that record a magnetic field. So in the summer, we can hopefully start measuring at a different CT scanner, which actually goes down to 300 nanometers. And that's already a lot better, but still not down to 50 nanometers, which is sort of the boundary for magnetic grains to record the magnetic field. So right now, one of our colleagues is actually investigating if these smallest grains are of importance, because as you can see on the y-axis, their magnetic moment is very small compared to larger grains. But yeah, we're not sure yet, but if we don't need the smallest grains, then of course there's no problem anymore. If we do have a problem. And currently the only option to measure the grains between 50 and 300 nanometers is FIBSEM, which destroys your sample. So that's a bit of a downside. And another option is that the nano CTs will just get better and better over the years, which has happened so far, and maybe we can measure the smallest grains in the end as well. Another problem that we face is the segmentation. So on the left, there is an image. The red and blue stuff is the magnetic scan, and the black and red lines indicate the actual grains. And the yellow square indicates a part that we can invert at once. So what we do is we have a lot of areas of our scan that we invert and then combine in the end. And what happens is that at the boundary of these segments, there are magnetic grains that are either partially in there or just outside the CT scan, but they do have a magnetic field. And a magnetic field is not just contained within the grain, but also goes around it. And for the inversion, that is a bit of a problem because we do see a magnetic moment, but we cannot assign it to a grain if it's not in that segment. So yeah, we're working on actually making our inversion areas larger and our measured areas smaller, and hopefully that will be fixed sooner or later. And David will continue.
Thank you. Okay, I will talk about the theoretical side or how we recover the magnetizations from the grains. So this is an overview of the model we use. So assuming that the experimental data we have is well obtained, we have a on the top you see the signal from the magnetometer. This records the magnetic field that these grains in the rock sample produce. And there is a collection, as Rosa said, of different grains of sizes and properties. So far it's been assumed that most of these grains are like single oriented, this uniform magnetization, but there is not much research yet about the nature of these larger grains, in which kind of magnetic states they are, or maybe how stable they are. So this is what we are currently looking. What we want to investigate here is how from the surface signal, how can we obtain the magnetizations of the individual grains? So for that, for this model, we also need like a geometric profile of every grain, and we do that with micro-CT, as was shown before. One of the models we have is to turn this pixelated data from the micro-CT into voxels. So we use this to write a model for the magnetic potential of every grain. Which we use to calculate the magnetic field and then to make an inversion problem and then obtain the magnetizations. Here is one of the areas that we use to test our theoretical model. So we have the scan surface. So this is the magnetic field recorded by the magnetometer. Then with the micro-CT, we obtain the different grains within the sample, which have different shapes and are located in different places. And from this, we formulate a mathematical problem, an inversion problem that we use to infer the magnetization of each one of these small grains. We have two different methods to do this. One is to assume that all of the grains only have a dipole signal. So mostly we look at the, we assume that they are uniformly magnetized, but we know that larger grains have a more complex internal configurations, and to look into that, we need to consider higher order terms in the magnetic potential, which is written on the top right. And when we expand this, I'm not going into detail, but we have different terms which are in the magnetic moments, which is the dipole moments, quadrupole moments, octupole moments. Usually the magnetization is obtained from the dipole moments, but more information is contained for more complex geometries in these higher order terms. And we use this model, so for each grain we obtain all of these magnetic moments. And we are trying to figure out what's the nature of them. For example, this model helps us to have a better description of the magnetic field. So if you look at the top left, this is what the experiments of the magnetometer measures. How can we reproduce this with the inversion? If we only assume that the grains are dipoles or are uniformly magnetized, we have this inversion, which is reproduces well the experimental signal, but at the bottom you see that the residual, which is the error, are quite large around certain grains. So that means that these grains might have a more complex structure inside. And when we consider the higher order magnetic moments in the magnetic potential, we start to see that when we do the inversion, the errors start to decrease significantly. So that's a success for this model. So, but however, although we can explain the magnetic field correctly, there is not much what we can say about the internal structure of every grain. And what we are now analyzing is to figure out what's the magnetic state within the grain. So for that, we need to reconstruct or to combine the experimental data to create the geometric profiles and simulate them using micromagnetic theory. So from the micro-CT, from those pixelated data, we can reconstruct, for example, the surface of a grain, and then we input this into a micromagnetic code that give us in which kind of internal state these grains can be. So this is currently on submitted, this work. But for example, this grain from a synthetic sample, we can obtain different state that it can possibly be. We simulate this with the micromagnetic software, and each one of these states produce a different magnetic signal. And these signals, which is the magnetic field produced by each one of these configurations, can be compared directly with the signals that we see in the microscope. And if they match, we can say, okay, this grain is in this state, or this grain is in this other state, and so on. Using this to reproduce these signals correctly, we need these higher order terms, as I explained before, the higher order magnetic moments. So the theory we developed before is necessary to obtain these results. And from this, we hope to understand better what are the future, what is the stability of these grains in these states, to have better way of discriminating the good grains, the ones which have good signals with the magnetic field of the Earth, and the bad grains which are probably unstable, so their signal is not very reliable to say with certainty what's a good magnitude for the magnetic field of the Earth. So thank you. If you have any questions, please ask.